Let me start by saying, right up front and with no rancor, that I know I performed poorly earlier this year in my debate with archaeologist Flint Dibble on the Joe Rogan Experience. That's JRE 2136 of April 16th, 2024. Flint is a better debater than me. He was better prepared than me. His ability to deliver what he had prepared far outmatched my own, and he was faster on his feet than I was. So kudos to Flint for his performance, on which I congratulate him. Indeed, I did congratulate him in an email I sent him a few hours after the debate, where I wrote, "It was good to talk to you today. You speak well for your cause." I was impressed. Throughout our confrontation, I took Flint at face value as an archaeologist passionately opposed to my views on prehistory, who'd come to the table to discuss his differences with me. I took it for granted that his knowledge of archaeology would be superior to my own and would be presented with complete transparency. So when Flint made seemingly authoritative statements concerning supposedly solid archaeological data that I had no prior knowledge of, I believed him. I was convinced. Besides, in the fast-moving format of the Joe Rogan Experience, there was no real-time opportunity for me to fact-check what he was telling me. Where I have done so subsequently, however, what I've found has shaken the confidence that I initially had in Flint. For example, the subject of sunken shipwrecks and what they tell us about the past. Flint's case was that my supposed lost seafaring civilization of the Ice Age must surely have left behind some evidence of its existence in the form of shipwrecks, since, as he put it,
at this point, we have something like 3 million shipwrecks from around the world. And so one of my questions for Graham is, if this is a global civilization with ships, why is it that we don't have shipwrecks from this global civilization? I see this as a big, big problem. If we're looking for a civilization that's traversing the oceans, we should find these shipwrecks. And similarly, these shipwrecks are located near the coast. They're located on the submerged continental shelves. We are actually exploring these submerged continental shelves in detail.
My goodness, not only are there 3 million shipwrecks from around the world, but also we know where they are. We've pinpointed their exact locations on the submerged continental shelves. With that much knowledge at our disposal, the fact that not a single shipwreck from a lost seafaring civilization of the Ice Age is amongst them, not even one out of 3 million, does indeed raise questions about the very existence of such a civilization. I didn't know that archaeologists had factual data on 3 million submerged shipwrecks, and I felt backed into a corner by my own ignorance. When I got round to fact-checking Flint's presentation some months later, however, I found that his handling of the whole matter had left several unanswered questions which I'd woefully failed to task him with during the debate itself. For example, since it's no secret that many of the JRE's multi-million audience are listeners rather than viewers, and that on-screen captions are easily overlooked even by viewers, including myself in this case, why did he only offer an on-screen caption to disclose that his impressive figure of 3 million shipwrecks is not a fact confirmed by observation, but a UNESCO estimate? Why did he not disclose that the number of shipwrecks actually located around the world today is less than 250,000, of which the vast majority are less than 1,000 years old? And why did he reiterate confidently later in the interview that
we have 3 million shipwrecks that have been mapped?
Sitting in Joe's studio, face to face with Dibble, I took his word as an archaeologist that 3 million shipwrecks had been mapped, and I didn't offer a counter-argument. Looking back on the whole exchange with the benefit of hindsight, knowing now that the actual number of located shipwrecks is less than 1/10 of Flint's figure, I wonder why that debating point mattered so much to him that he was prepared to use such tactics to win it. Surely better to be open about the real figures and then have a real debate over what conclusions about Ice Age seafaring we might reasonably draw from them. A point of information here. The last Ice Age, also known as the last glacial period, dates from approximately 115,000 years ago to around 11,600 years ago. It is at some point during this lengthy period, closer to its end than to its beginning, that I've always proposed that my lost civilization flourished. Meanwhile, the most ancient shipwreck so far identified by archaeologists, found at a depth of 30 meters offshore the Greek island of Dokos, is only around 4,600 years old, some 7,000 years after the end of the Ice Age. Not a single plank from the ship itself remains, as everything biodegradable was long ago consumed by the sea. What has survived, however, is the ship's non-biodegradable cargo, in the form of hundreds of clay amphorae and other ceramic vessels now scattered on the seabed. The next oldest shipwreck, dated to 3,300 years ago, more than 8,000 years after the end of the Ice Age, lies at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, 90 kilometers off the coast of Israel. Here, too, the structure of the ship itself hasn't survived, but its cargo of amphorae has. The most ancient intact shipwreck is 2,400 years old and lies at the bottom of the Black Sea at the remarkable depth of nearly 2 kilometers. Because there's almost no oxygen in the Black Sea at such depths, and therefore little biodegradation, the ship's timbers remain well preserved. Meanwhile, the oldest boat of any kind so far discovered is a dugout canoe, dated to around 10,000 years ago, 1,600 years after the end of the Ice Age. The canoe was extracted from a peat bog in the Netherlands in 1955 during the construction of a road and is now on display in the Drents Museum in Assen. So far, so good for Flint's case, until we take into account another fact of great significance that he failed to disclose during the debate. Despite the absence of submerged shipwrecks from the period, all archaeologists fully accept that seafaring did occur during the Ice Age, and on a surprising scale. I'll confine myself here to 2 examples out of many, the peopling of Australia and the peopling of Cyprus. In the case of Australia, it's important to keep in mind that sea level was about 120 meters lower at the peak of the last Ice Age than it is today. In consequence, large parts of the Indonesian and Malay archipelagos that are now separate islands formed a continuous Ice Age landmass. Geologists refer to it as Sunda, directly connected to mainland Asia. At the same time, New Guinea and Australia were connected, forming the paleocontinent geologists refer to as Sahul. It would therefore have been relatively straightforward for migrants from Asia to travel by land, plus a little island hopping, as far as Timor. Thereafter, even at the last glacial maximum, it wouldn't have been possible to migrate onwards to Sahul, Australia, without undertaking an open ocean voyage of more than 90 kilometers. Writing in Nature's scientific reports, Michael Bird and co-authors have this to say: the first peopling of Sahul by anatomically modern humans required multiple maritime crossings, with at least one approaching 100 kilometers. We conclude that anatomically modern humans had the capacity to plan and make open sea voyages lasting several days by at least 50,000 years ago. The conclusion is completely justified, since even the most skeptical archaeologists now accept the overwhelming evidence that Australia has been continuously inhabited by anatomically modern humans for more than 50,000 years. From this, 2 unavoidable conclusions follow. First, the earliest migrants must already have mastered the arts of shipbuilding and open ocean navigation before they made the journey. Secondly, they must have been able to construct watercraft big enough and sturdy enough to carry sufficient numbers of migrants of reproductive age to avoid the risk of extinction. Unsurprisingly, though Flint failed to disclose this during our debate, the fact that no submerged shipwrecks have yet been found that testify to that migration isn't offered by any archaeologist as evidence that no migration occurred. There are parallels in the case of Cyprus. Even at the peak of the last ice age, when sea levels were at their lowest, Cyprus, surrounded as it is by great deeps, always remained an island. Until about 30 years ago, archaeologists adamantly rejected all evidence that suggested it might have been colonized at any point during the Ice Age, because their preferred hypothesis, or shall we call it a preconception, was that seafaring in the Mediterranean didn't begin until well into the Neolithic, around 9,000 years ago. Today, to the credit of archaeology, there has been a paradigm shift, and the evidence that forced it isn't the discovery of submerged Ice Age shipwrecks, but irrefutable proof that the colonization of Cyprus did in fact occur during the Ice Age, at least as early as 12,000 years ago, and perhaps more than 14,000 years ago. In a paper published in the Journal of Maritime Archaeology in 2020, Bernard Knapp, Professor of Mediterranean Archaeology at the University of Glasgow and Honorary Research Fellow at the Cyprus American Archaeological Research Institute, confirms there can be no question that prehistoric seafarers sailed between the Levantine and/or Anatolian coasts and Cyprus some 12,000 years ago, possibly several times per year, in order to transport large ruminants like weaned calves or small wild boar on boats much more sophisticated than we might imagine. Those who undertook these maritime ventures had the ability to design and construct seacraft and to navigate, most likely on a seasonal basis, across the open sea from some adjacent mainland, be it some 50 to 60 kilometers from the nearest point in Anatolia or about 95 kilometers from the nearest point in the Levant. Subsequently, in a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2024, Corey Bradshaw and co-authors used the, quote, latest archaeological data, hind-casted climate projections, and age-structured demographic models, unquote, to demonstrate evidence for early arrival, 14,257 to 13,182 calendar years ago, to Cyprus. Large groups of people, 1,000 to 1,375, arrived in 2 to 3 main events occurring within 100 years to ensure low extinction risk. These results indicate that the post-glacial settlement of Cyprus involved only a few large-scale organized events requiring advanced watercraft technology. It's no easy matter to settle a previously uninhabited island and make a long-term success of the venture. Thus, the paper's co-authors conclude, quote, the large founding population we estimated is best viewed as an insurance policy against the likelihood of extinction. Our analysis on the frequency of arrivals also supports the idea of large and by inference planned migrations to the island. In other words, many small sporadic forays of unconnected people over long periods of time were unlikely to support a permanent population. It should go without saying that a project involving organized migrations aboard vessels capable of carrying large numbers of settlers across more than 50 kilometers of open water is the sort of undertaking that we would normally associate with a civilization of some sort. In the case of Cyprus, as in the case of Australia, regardless of the absence of submerged shipwrecks, there is now no doubt that such migrations did occur during the last ice age and could only have been accomplished on board seagoing vessels. To accept that some humans had ships during the ice age without any evidence of submerged shipwrecks from the period, yet to use the same absence of submerged shipwrecks to cast doubt on the hypothesis of a lost civilization of the ice age, exhibits, to say the least, a double standard. But even more slippery, in my opinion, was Flint's failure to inform the audience of the archaeological consensus that humans were indeed seafarers deep in the Ice Age. Had he done so, his whole argument around the shipwreck issue, which I was initially floored by, would have been null and void. My bad, I guess, for not having the facts at my fingertips in the debate when I needed them. The issue of metallurgy more than 12,000 years ago has never been one that I've pursued in my quest for a lost civilization of the Ice Age. So I'm grateful to my friend Mano Safzada for his Facebook post a few days after the debate, in which he drew attention to an apparent problem with Flint's presentation. At 18 minutes 6 seconds of the YouTube screening of the debate, Flint makes the following claims.
Graham has acknowledged that there's a good chance there's no metallurgy, for example, with this civilization. He said maybe a decision was made not to use metals. And I'd say we could definitively prove there was no large-scale metallurgy in the Ice Age. If you look at ice cores in the Arctic, right, we can track metallurgy of the Roman period, of medieval periods, based on lead emissions that end up in these ice cores. And there are no emissions from metallurgy in the Ice Age. So we can be sure that there's no global metallurgical civilization that's doing a lot of mining and smelting. Certainly they're not burning fossil fuels like they might be in the 18th or 19th century. So we know that could not have been around that early because it would show up in the atmosphere.
To vouch for the supposed truth of these claims, Flint relies on the slide he displayed as he made them. The graph featured in Flint's slide is taken from this 2018 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, PNAS. Unfortunately for the audience, however, this 2018 PNAS paper doesn't deal with the Ice Age at all, but only with metal levels in the Greenland ice cores for the period from 1100 BC to 800 AD. The graph and text Flint shows on screen for a few seconds leave no opportunity for readers to grasp that there's no mention of Ice Age levels in the paper. It seems to add a final seal of approval to his statement.
And there are no emissions from metallurgy in the Ice Age.
By contrast, contradicting Flint's claims, this 1996 paper in Earth and Planetary Sciences Letters demonstrates high metal levels in the Greenland ice cores during the Ice Age. Likewise, this 1988 paper shows that the extraordinary spikes in metal levels during the Ice Age have been found not only in the Greenland ice cores, but also in ice cores from Antarctica. In summary, muddying the waters of Flint's claims, the 1996 paper demonstrates high atmospheric metal levels in the Greenland ice cores during the Ice Age, and the 1988 paper demonstrates high atmospheric metal levels in Antarctic ice cores during the Ice Age. The authors of both papers speculate, I repeat, speculate, about possible natural sources, wind, dust, volcanoes, etc. But they never consider or even give a moment's thought to the alternative possibility that human metallurgy might have been the cause of these extraordinary spikes in metal levels, presumably because archaeologists advised them that there was no metallurgy in the Ice Age and therefore no point in looking for it. What the authors offer by way of explaining the anomalous spikes is therefore a perfectly respectable hypothesis, but not any kind of proof of Flint's claim that, quote, there are no emissions from metallurgy in the Ice Age, end quote. I'm therefore puzzled that to support his case, Flint cited only the 2018 paper, which doesn't deal with Ice Age atmospheric metal levels in the ice cores at all, while ignoring potentially contradictory evidence in the other two papers. Surely the right thing would have been to cite the 1996 and 1988 papers, which do show high Ice Age atmospheric metal levels. With that done and the need for disclosure satisfied, Flint could full-throatedly have sought to explain those high levels as the results of wind, dust, volcanism, etc., and not the results of metallurgy. But shouldn't the audience have been given all the relevant facts in order to make informed decisions about what they were being told? Are there special tests that can distinguish between atmospheric metals arising from Earth's natural processes and atmospheric metals that are definitively anthropogenic, in other words, man-made? YouTuber Dan Richards reached out to leading glaciologist Dr. Peter Neff with this exact question. Here's their exchange on X, which Richards made public on 24th April 2024 in this video on his debunking channel.
To make certain my assumption about this was correct, that the scientists involved don't test for lead very often in older ice cores, I asked Dr. Peter Neff, aka Icy Pete, and he helped me out, as you can see.
Richards, his X handle is SuperSexyD, summarizes, quote, "Lead isn't usually looked for unless they're looking for human activity. It's not something an ice core from 20,000 years before the present is likely to be tested for during an analysis. If I'm wrong, please correct me." Neff confirms, "Think we got it. Happy to be a resource." The logical conclusion from Neff's advice, given while serving as a neutral resource, is that Ice Age ice cores aren't specifically tested for traces of metallurgy, and that therefore to affirm with certainty, as Flint did during the debate, that there are no emissions from metallurgy in the Ice Age is to overstate current scientific knowledge on the subject. However, this wasn't the end of the matter. As Richards tells us in the video, Dibble sought out his X exchange with Neff and interjected with this bizarre warning. I describe Dibble's warning as bizarre because the issue at stake here isn't what he ignorantly describes in that X exchange as an absence of lead from Ice Age ice cores. On the contrary, as he should have known if he felt qualified to pronounce on the matter at all, the 1996 and 1988 papers cited earlier show that lead is abundantly present in Ice Age ice cores from both Greenland and Antarctica. The heart of the matter, sidelined by Dibble, is that these ice cores have never been specifically tested for traces of metallurgy, and that it is therefore irresponsible to state with certainty, as Dibble did during our debate, that
there are no emissions from metallurgy in the Ice Age.
A more disturbing aspect of Dibble's intervention, however, is its intention, which with the use of loaded language like pseudoscientist has every appearance of a bid to devalue Richards in the eyes of Neff and other scientists. Certainly that's how Richards himself views the whole exchange, which he describes as Dibble posting
scorched earth crap where he wants to make sure that no scientist will give me any information whatsoever. I guess, science educators nowadays are afraid of people that might use science in a way that undermines their bullshit.
Whether or not metallurgy was being done somewhere on Earth during the Ice Age isn't a fight I have a dog in. I've focused on Dibble's handling of the issue here for the light it sheds on his debating strategy as a self-styled science educator. Something that I'd allowed to get under my skin much more than I should have, and that put me on edge during the debate, was my previous history with Flint, going back more than a year. While he has not actually outright labelled me a racist and white supremacist, and continues to deny ever doing so, he has frequently associated me and my work with racism and white supremacism in such a way as to insinuate that I am, at the very least, a closet white supremacist and racist. In this interview, given to the British newspaper The Guardian on 27th November 2022, for example, where he alleges that my ideas, quote, strip indigenous people of their rich heritage and instead give credit to aliens or white people, end quote, or in an article he contributed to The Conversation on 18th November 2022, where he excoriated my alleged use of race science. Quote, "This sort of race science is outdated and long since debunked, especially given the strong links between Atlantis and Aryans proposed by several Nazi quote-unquote archaeologists." The most recent example of this strategy came on 16th April 2024, during the debate itself, when Flint confidently proclaimed,
I did not say that Graham reinforces white supremacist ideas.
On the same day, however, he had arranged for an article that he had pre-written to be published in Sapiens Anthropology magazine, in which he states, Hancock and other pseudo-archaeologists center white Europeans as able creators, while chalking up the accomplishments of other peoples to outside influences, end quote. Which of Flint Dibble's two statements is true? The one made on the JRE, or the one in Sapiens Anthropology magazine? It's said that there's no smoke without fire. So is there any fire behind Flint's smoke? This is a question that I'd already addressed as early as January 2023 in my formal response to an open letter from the Society for American Archaeology, the SAA, of which Flint is an enthusiastic member, demanding that Netflix relabel Ancient Apocalypse as science fiction, and asserting that it has a long-standing association with racist, white supremacist ideologies, does injustice to indigenous peoples, and emboldens extremists. Specifically, the SAA accused me, as Flint himself has later continued to do, of proclaiming that white survivors of my proposed lost civilization, quote, were responsible for the cultural heritage of indigenous peoples in the Americas and around the world. However, the narratives on which claims of white saviors are based have been demonstrated to be ones modified by Spanish conquistadors and colonial authorities for their own benefit. These were subsequently used to promote violent white supremacy. Hancock's narrative emboldens extreme voices that misrepresent archaeological knowledge in order to spread false historical narratives that are overtly misogynistic, chauvinistic, racist, and anti-Semitic. Flint has read my detailed reply to the SAA open letter, but during the debate itself he took no account of anything I'd put on record in it, and he continues to take no account of it whatsoever in his ongoing efforts to smear me with insinuations of racism and white supremacism. I therefore take this opportunity, again, for the record, to restate the relevant passages from my 30 January 2023 reply to the SAA open letter. Graham Hancock to SAA, 30th January 2023. As to the allegations made in the open letter that my work promotes racism and white supremacism, as well as misogyny, chauvinism, and anti-Semitism, it must presumably be an inconvenient fact for the SAA that there is not a hint of misogyny, chauvinism, or anti-Semitism in Ancient Apocalypse, and that neither race nor white skin are mentioned in any episode of the series. The SAA is therefore reduced once again to smearing by association and to making thinly veiled accusations that my interest in the possibility of a lost civilization of the Ice Age, most recently explored in Ancient Apocalypse, is in some way inherently racist and white supremacist. Although there is much more to say in refutation, it's sufficient to note here that since I began work on this subject more than 30 years ago, the locations I've considered as a possible homeland for a hypothetical lost civilization of the Ice Age don't include any part of white Europe, but do include the ancient Americas, the ancient Sunda Shelf, submerged lands around Indonesia, ancient Antarctica, and ancient India. So, if not from Ancient Apocalypse, where do the SAA's accusations of racism and white supremacism originate? The answer is spin around some of the contents of some of my previous books, in particular my 1995 book, Fingerprints of the Gods, where I reference several indigenous Native American myths in which white-skinned, bearded gods are portrayed as the bringers of culture and civilization, very often after some great global cataclysm. Since the SAA is accusing me of empowering racism and white supremacism by citing these myths, the issue of whether or not they were tampered with by the Spaniards becomes central. In its open letter, the SAA presents it as an established fact that the myths were indeed tampered with in Spanish interests. And it's true that growing numbers of archaeologists do believe that. It is not a fact, however. Rather, it's a body of opinion and conjecture which even today is subject to dispute and disagreement, and which in the early and mid-1990s, when I researched and wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, was not a prominent view on the subject. Certainly some authorities, for example Inga Clendinnen in 1991, Fierce and Unnatural Cruelty, Cortes and the Conquest of Mexico, were very much in the tampered with camp. But in stark contrast, a great many more equally well-qualified scholars had no doubt that the myths collected by early Spanish visitors to Mexico in the decades after the conquest were authentic and untampered with. So when I reported these as authentic indigenous myths in Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995, I not only did so in good faith, but also found myself in the good company of, amongst many others, Jacques Lafay, then Professor of Latin American History at the Sorbonne, Quetzalcoatl and Guadeloupe, 1987. Michael D. Coe, then Professor of Anthropology and Curator in the Peabody Museum of Natural History at Yale University, Mexico, 1988. Mexicanist John Bierhorst, The Mythology of Mexico and Central America, 1990. Renowned Mexican anthropologist and historian Miguel Leon Portilla, then at the Instituto Indigenista Interamericano, Mexico City. The Broken Spears, expanded and updated edition, 1992. David Carrasco, director of the Moses Mesoamerican Archive at Harvard University's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, Quetzalcoatl and the Irony of Empire, 1992. And historian Hugh Thomas, Conquest, Montezuma, Cortez and the Fall of Old Mexico, 1993. None of these works, or the use within them of myths of returning white saviors, as the SAA typecasts these complex and varied accounts, attracted the least outcry of racism or white supremacism at the time they were published. Nor do they do so now. Neither have there been accusations of racism and white supremacy made against other authorities, who have subsequently drawn upon the same corpus of Quetzalcoatl myths that I drew on in Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995. These authorities include Neil Baldwin, Legends of the Plumed Serpent, Biography of a Mexican God, 1998. John Pohl, Aztecs and Conquistadors, The Spanish Invasion and the Collapse of the Aztec Empire, 2005. And Michael Wood, Conquistadors, 2010. Of the greatest significance to the ongoing debate over the authenticity of indigenous Mesoamerican myths about a returning white savior. Again, white savior is the SAA's phrase, not mine. Have been two studies in particular. These are the revised edition, 2000, with an important new chapter added of David Carrasco's Quetzalcoatl and the Irony of Empire, and H.B. Nicholson's magisterial Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl, the once and future king of the Toltecs, 2001, reprinted in 2008, and again in 2015. Although based on his 1957 PhD thesis, which I didn't have the opportunity to examine when I was researching Fingerprints of the Gods, Nicholson's Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl strongly reinforces the authenticity and legitimacy of the same indigenous Mexican myths collected by Spaniards in the decades after the conquest that I drew upon. Yet far from there being an outcry about it, the book has been twice reprinted since 2001 and widely lauded by scholars. As David Carrasco puts it, no one has been able to organize the existing primary sources or interpret them as deeply and clearly as he has. No one has surpassed Nicholson, and no one will. It's not necessary to multiply examples here. To state matters briefly, my response to the SAA's accusations of racism and white supremacism is that they are not based on a representative analysis of the content of my work or of my general outlook and behavior, but solely on the fact that I cited certain indigenous myths from the Americas that certain scholars think were tampered with by Spaniards. In Fingerprints of the Gods, I concluded responsibly, in line with the consensus of many authorities at the time, that the myths are authentic, and I reported them accordingly. There is a further point that needs to be driven home, however. If the myths were not tampered with by the Spaniards, if they are genuinely indigenous, as I believed in 1995, and as I still believe today, then even the elastic logic of the SAA cannot stretch to attaching a racist or white supremacist burden to them. On the contrary, it seems to me that if any party is guilty of racism and white supremacism here, it is the SAA itself, with its predominantly white membership and its claim to possess superior knowledge of the truth about indigenous myths, knowledge superior even to that of the indigenous inhabitants of Mexico in the 16th century, who shared those myths in the first place. I will close with comments by David Carrasco on anthropologist Inga Clendinin's attempts to dismiss, on the grounds that it is a, quote, splendidly implausible, unquote, web of Spanish fictions, the notion, central to the myths, that the Aztecs believed Cortés and the white-skinned bearded Spaniards, quotes, were the returning Quetzalcoatl, end quote, and the parallel notion that this belief greatly weakened Moctezuma, making him hopelessly indecisive and ultimately leading him to abdicate. These myths primarily come down to us through the 16th century Florentine Codex of Father Bernardino de Sahagún, who was fluent in Nahuatl, the Aztec language, who worked assiduously with teams of indigenous knowledge keepers to prepare the 12 books of the Codex, and who was undoubtedly the most thorough and principled of all the Spanish collectors and compilers of the indigenous myths, traditions, and histories of Mexico. Clendinin, however, wants to claim that the myths of the returning Quetzalcoatl have no indigenous origin, were entirely concocted by Cortés himself in a 1520 letter to the King of Spain, and were later picked up second-hand by Sahagún. I have no doubt, writes Carrasco, that Cortés was striving to impress the royal mind with his extraordinary management skills, or that his literary craft was elegant and profoundly political. What is challenging to me is Clendinin's claim that this Spanish political fiction of both Quetzalcoatl returning and Moctezuma's vacillation and collapse was picked up by Sahagún, who powerfully reinforced it, erroneously thinking it was an Indian belief, when in fact the ruler's gesture of abdication was a very late dawning story, making its first appearance 30 or more years after the conquest. The stunning implication is that this Spanish fiction, the story of Moctezuma's paralysis, parades down the years through the literature and scholarship and is internalized by commentators less wary than Clendinin, all the way to Leon Portilla, who falls unconsciously under Cortés' charismatic pen along with the rest of us. This means Leon Portilla's extensive Nahuatl training and sense of the Aztec ethos, not to mention Sahagún's profound familiarity with Spanish native exchanges, contribute no effective critical stance in relation to the Spanish literary craft, which later Spaniards were not aware of, and which a number of Indians internalized as their own. Carrasco concludes that the work of Clendinnen and others carries a bloated sense, a transcendent sense, that the Spaniards, led by the incomparable Cortés, made up the facts of the story, while the Indians merely repeated them unknowingly. The same sense of superior knowledge, of claiming insights that the indigenous inhabitants themselves supposedly did not share, applies to the spin put by the SAA on the myths of Quetzalcoatl's return that I reported in Fingerprints of the Gods. Far from seeking to promote racism and white supremacism, my purpose in that book, and in all my subsequent work, very much including Ancient Apocalypse, has been to honor indigenous voices and perspectives in ways that the SAA, despite much virtue signaling, does not. Finally, returning to Flint's baseless allegation that I, quote, center white Europeans as able creators while chalking up the accomplishments of other peoples to outside influences, end quote, let's see what I've actually said on the record about the ethnic makeup of my proposed lost Ice Age civilization. First, a regret. Words like Negro, Negroid, and Caucasian, Caucasoid were already politically incorrect in 1995 when I used them in Fingerprints of the Gods. 6 years earlier, however, in 1989, the word Negroid was still being used in The African Origins of Civilization, a highly regarded book by Senegalese scholar Cheikh Anta Diop to describe the physical appearance of people from Africa south of the Sahara. Meanwhile, in 1997, 2 years after the publication of Fingerprints, the Washington Post clearly felt no discomfort using the term Caucasoid in this report. And as late as 2008, in Chapter 3 of a book titled Everyday Anti-Racism, contributor Karo Mukapate still found it necessary to write, quote, "It is high time we got rid of the word Caucasian," end quote. I regret my own use of these much outdated and politically loaded terms in Fingerprints of the Gods. Even 30 years ago, this showed a lack of sensitivity on my part, while at the same time handing my critics a stick to beat me with decades later. Nonetheless, as those who have actually read Fingerprints must know, I attached no suggestion of racial superiority either to the terms Negro, Negroid, or to the terms Caucasian, Caucasoid. I handled the matter clumsily, for sure, but my purpose was solely to draw attention to descriptions in ancient indigenous traditions of the Americas and ancient indigenous sculptures of the Americas that seemed to refer to individuals who had visited the so-called New World in the remotest past, but whose physical appearance was very different from those of Native Americans today. Of particular note are the sculptures and reliefs attributed to the Olmec culture of the Gulf of Mexico, most famously the megalithic Olmec heads, but also a figure carved in high relief on a giant monolithic slab excavated in the 1940s. On account of its high-bridged nose and long flowing beard, the figure was dubbed Uncle Sam, after the iconic national personification of the USA by the excavator, American archaeologist Matthew Stirling. Meanwhile, this screenshot from the Kindle edition of Fingerprints of the Gods gives some insight into my thoughts on the Olmec mystery. If so, we may be gazing at faces from a much more remote past than we imagine when we stare into the almond eyes of one of the Negro heads, or into the angular, chiseled Caucasian features of Uncle Sam. It is by no means impossible that these great works preserve the images of peoples from a vanished civilization which embraced several different ethnic groups. Similar, seemingly non-indigenous facial types are also portrayed at Monte Alban, 500 miles away. There, stacked loosely against the side of a low pyramid, were the objects I'd come all this way to see. Several dozen engraved stelae depicting Negroes and Caucasians, equal in life, equal in death. If a great civilization had indeed been lost to history, and if these sculptures told part of its story, the message conveyed was one of racial equality. No one who has seen the pride or felt the charisma of the great Negro heads from La Venta could seriously imagine that the original subjects of these magisterial sculptures could have been slaves. Neither did the lean-faced, bearded men look as if they would have bent their knees to anyone. They, too, had an aristocratic demeanor. So in summary, what I actually said in Fingerprints of the Gods was people dissimilar to the Native Americans today and more similar to modern whites and blacks visited the Americas at some time in the extremely remote past. The physical appearance of these people, as recorded in the Olmec and Monte Alban sculptures, was diverse, suggesting an egalitarian, multi-ethnic society. The civilizations of both the Old World and the New World may have shared a legacy of influence and ideas from an as yet unidentified, lost civilization. This is very far indeed from the caricature of my work presented by Flint Dibble to support his allegation that I center white Europeans as able creators, while chalking up the accomplishments of other peoples to outside influences. On the contrary, I have never given special credit to white Europeans anywhere in my work, and I have never looked for the homeland of a lost civilization anywhere in Europe, much of which was a frozen wasteland during the Ice Age, when I proposed my lost civilization flourished. Besides, as Flint well knows, there were no such people as white Europeans during the Ice Age. Flint's entire case, that I center white Europeans as able creators while chalking up the accomplishments of other peoples to outside influences, therefore proves to be a farrago of propaganda, expressed in weasel language, designed to harm an opponent without taking responsibility for the damage done. There is much more that I could add, but I'll confine myself to one more example here. Not so much from the debate itself, as from public statements about the debate, subsequently made by Dibble. For example, on 4th May 2024, interviewed by Indy 100 for an article modestly titled "How I Took on Joe Rogan and Graham Hancock and Won," Dibble had the following to say. Quote, "I'll be optimistic and say that I won," Dibble laughed, noting that a quarter of the way through their discussion, at 1 hour 27 minutes to be precise, Hancock clearly admitted that there is at present no evidence for an advanced civilization. On X on 20th June 2024, Dibble doubled down on his claim that I had admitted there is no evidence for my proposed lost civilization of the Ice Age. Some readers of this post might have been persuaded, as Dibble obviously intended, that after devoting more than 30 years of my life to investigating the possibility of a lost civilization of the Ice Age, and publishing thousands of pages on the subject supported by detailed footnotes as to sources, I still had no evidence for its existence. And even the small proportion who did go on to click the link at the end of the post might not have realized that I was being quoted out of context. Here's the full exchange on this subject.
I have to really repeat myself here.
Yeah, I can go back up there.
We're looking at
Bimini?
less than 5% of the continental shelves that have been studied at all by archaeology. I'm not surprised that we find hunter-gatherer traces underwater. I'm very glad that we do. I would be very surprised if we didn't. But what I'm saying is that not enough of that 27 million square kilometers has been investigated. Only a tiny fraction has been investigated. And that fraction is not enough to draw the conclusion that we can absolutely say there was no lost lost civilization. Same goes for the Amazon rainforest. Same goes for the Sahara Desert.
But can we say there's no evidence for an advanced civilization in what they have studied?
In what they have studied, yes, we can say there's no evidence for an advanced civilization. But that brings us to another issue of what is studied and what is not studied by archaeology.
And this is the crucial point, which I would have driven home at much greater length if I'd known that my opponent would later take the rest of the exchange out of context and use it against me. In the archaeological sites I'm interested in, the Great Pyramid and the Great Sphinx of Giza, for example, or Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, or Serpent Mound in Ohio, or the Moai of Easter Island, I draw extensively on data gathered by archaeologists. Indeed, I've stated frequently that without their data, none of my work would have been possible. But I don't study what they study. I look in the same directions they do, but my focus is entirely different. In the case of the Great Pyramid, it's a matter of abiding interest to me, and a matter of absolute indifference to archaeologists, that its height and base perimeter, scaled up by 43,200, encode respectively the polar radius and the equatorial circumference of the Earth. In the case of the Great Sphinx, more than a century of study has yet to provide any compelling evidence as to who carved it out of the bedrock of the Giza Plateau, or when. Despite this, archaeologists teach, for the most part unanimously, and with no reservations, that it is entirely a work of the 4th dynasty pharaoh Khafre. I disagree with this collective acquiescence in the Khafre dogma, not because of anything I've learned from what archaeologists study, but precisely because I don't study what they study. I'm interested in the geological evidence, universally rejected by archaeologists, that the Sphinx may originally have been carved near the end of the last ice age, around 12,800 years ago. And I'm interested in the evidence from paleoastronomy, which reveals that the Sphinx faces due east, with its gaze targeting the rising sun at dawn on the spring equinox. Today, the zodiacal constellation against the background of which the sun rises on the spring equinox is Pisces, but 12,800 years ago, it was Leo. Archaeologists scoff at the very idea that the lion-bodied Sphinx might originally have been created by an astronomically minded civilization of the last ice age as a terrestrial representation of the constellation of Leo. But I've studied the matter deeply, finding worldwide evidence for recognition of the constellations of the zodiac during the Ice Age, and I suggest that archaeologists should think again. In the case of Göbekli Tepe, it's the same story. I don't study what archaeologists study. Their data is very useful to me, but the inferences I draw from it are completely different from theirs, and I look where they don't. So yes, it was a breakthrough for me when the late Dr. Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute carbon dated Göbekli Tepe's enclosure D to 11,600 years ago. It's why I immediately knew I had to learn more about this enigmatic place. But once I'd begun to immerse myself in its mysteries, it wasn't the archaeological findings that convinced me of a connection with my proposed lost civilization of the Ice Age. Although entirely ignored by archaeologists, the astronomical symbolism and alignments of the megaliths offered far more compelling evidence. In the case of Serpent Mound, although sidelined by archaeologists, it's the alignment of the great earthwork that provides evidence to support my lost civilization hypothesis. Likewise, in the case of Easter Island, I'm not looking where archaeologists look, or relying on their conclusions to underpin my hypothesis. My focus is on neglected matters, such as the Easter Island script and oral traditions of a great flood that submerged a primeval Pacific homeland. You get the picture? The context for my statement that there's no evidence for an advanced civilization in what they have studied is my immediate follow-up statement, edited out of the clip promoted by Dibble.
But that brings us to another issue of what is studied and what is not studied by archaeology.
I find my evidence in what is not studied by archaeology. I find my evidence by exploring undiscovered pathways. I find my evidence not by going from the known to the unknown, as Dibble describes archaeological methodology, but by abandoning all preconceived notions and diving straight into the unknown to see what I find. That there is no evidence of a lost Ice Age civilization in what archaeologists have studied is precisely why I and other mavericks like me are needed to focus attention on the puzzling gaps in our collective past that archaeologists haven't even begun to explain, and the tantalizing clues, hints and possibilities, mostly from outside their own discipline, that they've never followed up.